This is Flipping Pages, our ninth grade podcast. On today's episode, we conclude our discussion on the perks of being a wallflower. Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mr. Campbell, and welcome to Flipping Pages, a literature podcast where we take a look at different books and we talk about the themes, the characters, and anything else that we can come up with. Today we're going to conclude our talk on the perks of being a wallflower. The Perks of Being a Wallflower is written by Stephen Chbosky, and it's about a boy named Charlie, who is a freshman in high school, and it's about him, his adventures, his friends, and it's written in a very different way. It's a epistolary novel, which means it's written in short pieces. In this case, letters to a mysterious stranger we don't know who, but Charlie always signs them. Love always, Charlie. Now, at this point, things have gotten very bad. We talked about last week how Charlie has alienated himself from his friend group because he kissed his best friend Sam instead of his girlfriend at a party, and things have gotten pretty bad. It's very interesting to see how Charlie acts when he's alone versus when he's with his friends. When he's alone, he's much more introverted. Not that he's not introverted when he's with his friends, but things are different now. He has nobody to talk to. He just exists. And that's part of the problem with Charlie. Now then, we cannot talk about this part of the book without talking about the big revelation at the end. Let's talk about Aunt Helen. For those of you who can't remember, Aunt Helen is Charlie's maternal aunt, his mother's sister, who lived with his family for several years before she passed away in a car accident. And after he gets to have a experience with his friend Sam, we'll go back to that later, we learn something about Charlie that's very, very sad, and this is very difficult to talk about, so I understand if you aren't comfortable, listeners, but we need to talk about Charlie being sexually abused. As it turns out, his Aunt Helen was abusive, and it took him until he was a teenager to actually realize the damage she did to him. She would do it when they would watch TV while his siblings were asleep, and it was their little secret. It really says a lot about Charlie because now we understand how he has trouble relating to people, how he's been in and out of treatment for his mental illnesses, and it's very hard to understand why Charlie is able to handle what he is able to, if that makes sense. And it might be his relationship with his Aunt Helen that defines his relationships with everyone else. Charlie cries a lot, especially for a 16-year-old boy, 16-year-old boy at this point, but that being said, with somebody who is emotional, there's a lot of trauma in Charlie's life, and his parents try their best, but maybe there's not enough there to give him the support he needs until the end of the book. In Charlie's case, his Aunt Helen treated him very kindly, so he absolutely idolizes her. He puts people on pedestals as these great, unattainable things, but the truth of the matter is there are always going to be people who are damaged and who are going to mistreat you. In Charlie's case, it's so severe, but at the same time, we can't let the good things they do overwrite the bad things they do. So at this point, we know that Charlie's been abused, and the extent of it gets worse, as we find out on page 208. When he goes back to a hospital that he stayed at after his Aunt Helen died. I don't really want to talk about the questions or the answers, but I kind of figured out that everything I dreamt about my Aunt Helen was true. And after a while, I realized that it happened every Saturday when we would watch television. So here we have this kid, this such an important figure in his life, turned out to be a monster who took advantage of him every week. It destroyed this entire perception. And as absolutely terrible as it is for Charlie to go through this, we do find out that he has so much support. His grandfather wrote him a nice letter. So did his grandmother, his great aunt, his great uncle, his other aunt, all those cousins in Ohio, his friends, Patrick, Mary Elizabeth, Alice, Bob, even Peter and Craig. And that's just wonderful for Charlie to have this support system, because that's just the only way he's going to get through it. Charlie himself has a very interesting perspective on the entire thing. We're going to go ahead a little bit more to page 210. And he talks about how the horrible things that have happened to him, his mother, his aunt, all of them, mind you, are terrible. But without any one of those things happening, we wouldn't have the stories we have today. I guess there could be always somebody to blame. Maybe if my grandfather didn't hit her, my mom wouldn't be so quiet. And maybe she wouldn't have married my dad because he doesn't hit. And maybe I would never have been born. But I'm very glad to have been born. So I don't know what to say about it, especially since my mom seems happy with her life. And I don't know what else there is to want. It's like if I blamed my Aunt Helen, I would have to blame her dad for hitting her, and the friend of the family that fooled around with her when she was little, and the person that fooled around with him, and God for not stopping all this and things that are much worse. And I did do that for a while, but then I just couldn't anymore, because it wasn't going anywhere, because it wasn't the point. I'm not the way I am because what I dreamt and remembered about my Aunt Helen. That's what I figured out when things got quiet, and I think that's very important to know. It made things feel clear and together. Don't get me wrong, I know what happened was important, and I needed it to remember it. But it's like when my doctor told me the story of these two brothers whose dad was a bad alcoholic. One brother grew up to be a successful carpenter who never drank. The other brother ended up being a drinker as bad as his dad was. When they asked the first brother why he didn't drink, he said that after he saw what it did to his father, he could never bring himself to even try it. When they asked the other brother, he said he guessed he learned how to drink on his father's knee. So I guess we are who we are for a lot of reasons, and maybe we'll never know most of them. But even if we don't have the power to choose where we come from, we can still choose where we go from there. We can still do things, and we can even try to feel okay about them. So I guess this means now that Charlie is accepting what's happened to him, isn't going to define the rest of his life, and he's going to start trying to move forward. He'll have his work cut out for him, of course, because Sam and Patrick and all his other friends are moving on to college, and now he's the only kid in his own house, but he seems much more confident. There's definitely a tone change in this epilogue versus the previous sections, especially the last few letters where he seemed absolutely desperate to have connections. And I think that's a very powerful thing. What his aunt did was horrible. And I don't think there's any amount of time we can spend on this podcast to talk about just how horrible it was. Perhaps the next question we should answer is, where is Charlie going to go from here? He'll be in the 10th grade. Bill won't be his English teacher anymore, but he'll probably still offer him books. He read quite a few good books this past year. So what do you think some other books he might read next should be? He's read Catcher in the Rye, he read The Fountainhead. This book takes place in 1991 to 1992, so we have to remember the time frame here. He won't be able to read books like The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. He won't be able to read a book like The Kite Runner yet, although I think The Kite Runner would be absolutely up Charlie's alley. Perhaps he might be able to read some more nonfiction books like Night, or something along those lines. Charlie has such a way with empathy that books about horrible things resonate with him. Perhaps it has to do with his own abuse. Maybe he could also read something along the lines of maybe something comedic. Something a little bit lighter now that he's having to venture out on his own more. He never struck me as the type of person who would go out for sports, so I don't think we'll see him follow in his brother's footsteps. But at the same time, there are other clubs. There was the Earth Day Club that his sister was a part of. What's most important for Charlie is that he's able to be an individual. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship that Sam has with Charlie. When we first started this book, Sam and Charlie got along right away. Sam was this mysterious, older senior girl. She could drive. She did the Rocky Picture Horror Show. And she was just the girl of his dreams. But she turned him down flatly because not only did she have a boyfriend, we come to find out she doesn't want to be somebody's crush. She wants to be liked for who she is. She has her issues with the trauma in her own past, without him even beginning to understand the situation because he was just a young child. On the other hand, Sam and Charlie grow together throughout the year. She gives him his first kiss at Christmas time, and then, after she breaks up with her boyfriend, she tells Charlie that she is interested in him, but only wants to pursue something if he is completely honest with her about his own feelings. And when they kiss and start to escalate the experience, Charlie is reminded of the traumatic events in his life, and he's finally understanding what they were. At the same time, they promise to keep in touch when she goes off to college. Her going to Penn State with Charlie's older brother as a big part showed that sort of interest in him. Now, what was wrong with Aunt Helen's interest has been discussed several times already, but Sam's interest is the real key here. Because here comes this kid, he has no friends because his best friend killed himself the previous year. All his other friends have drifted apart. But here comes this kid who enters her life, and she takes him right under her wing and shows him what high school can offer. And that concludes this episode of Flipping Pages. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.